Hello and welcome to this special edition of Battleground Special Forces. In this episode, recorded on the ground in Kharkiv and Bucha, we examine two battles from the very opening hours of the invasion. The Spetsnaz assault on Kharkiv and the VDV Airborne operation at Hostomel airport outside Kyiv. Two of Russia's elite forces, two catastrophic failures, and the moment Russia's war plan began to fall apart. On the 24th of February 2022, Russian forces launched a full-scale invasion of Ukraine. Leading the ground assault in the east were units from the 2nd Guard Spetsnaz Brigade, Russia's elite special operations soldiers, trained by the GRU for exactly this kind of mission. We're standing outside the school in Kharkiv where some of those soldiers made their last stand. What happened here in the first hours of the war is a story of hubris, fierce resistance, and catastrophic miscalculation.
So, Julius, we're on the edge of Kharkiv, and this building behind us is relevant to an episode we put out a couple of weeks ago on the Battleground Special Forces Spetsnaz episode, in which you talked about a fierce gun battle that took place here, the early stages of the Ukraine war. It involved the 2nd Guard Spetsnaz Brigade, sort of storied unit, first formed in 1962 by the GRU, that's Russian intelligence, to give it behind-the-lines capability, a bit like our SAS or the SEAL Team 6 in the US. And on the morning of the 24th of February 2022, they were the spearhead to the advance into Kharkiv. What happened next?
Yeah, exactly. I mean, they were the spearhead. And I suppose the big thing that's difficult to sort of compute now is that they didn't expect any resistance. So they got in their fairly lightly armored vehicles and they just came driving straight down this road here. You know, the Russian border is only, I'm guessing now, but I want to say 30, 40 kilometers that way.
Yeah.
Kharkiv city is that way. And we're just coming into the, you know, we're in the outskirts of the city. So they came rolling down the road here. And then just further down, they came under fire, which must have been a bit of a surprise for them. And I'm sure initially they thought, you know, this is nothing, this will be fine. But it was fairly sustained fire, and they ended up retreating, looking for a position that they could fight from, and retreating into this school here. And at that point, more Ukrainians came in, other units came in, and they began to surround them. So they were effectively holed up in this school.
Yeah. Do we know anything about the numbers of Spetsnaz that were here? In the hundreds or 100 and fewer, maybe?
I would say, and it's a bit of a guess, but I would say several dozen.
Okay.
What we do know from eyewitnesses, the eyewitnesses say that nobody survived. So whether that's realistic or not, whether a few sneaked away in the middle of the night, I don't know. But I think it's fair to say that several dozen Spetsnaz, elite Spetsnaz soldiers died in this very building right
Okay,
here.
now the beats of the story are that it unfolded over a period of, I think, about 3 or 4 days. So the siege is underway in this building during that period?
Yes. So as I understand it, the heavy fighting went on from about 9 in the morning until about 10 in the evening. So it was 13 hours of sustained fighting. But there were several interludes where the Ukrainians stopped shooting and said, okay, guys, you're surrounded, time to give up. And the Spetsnaz just kept saying, no, no, no. And then finally what happened was the Ukrainians, they brought in a tank, they were firing at the building, and then they stormed the ground floor and they took the ground floor of the building. And Spetsnaz went up the stairs, but they still held the first and the second floor, and the Ukrainians couldn't dislodge them. So what happened right at the end of the fighting was that the Ukrainians actually withdrew, and they just kept pounding the building. And finally, the main gas line got caught and the whole thing just blew up and burned. And the way that the Ukrainians tell it, everybody burned in that building. All these Spetsnaz guys died. And there's this strange kind of, you know, this one man who gave eyewitness testimony, he had this strange kind of respect for that. He said, look, we hate them. They're Russians. He said this line, you know, he said, I wish they could come back to life so we could kill them again. But somehow we still respect them for that defense that they put up.
So we're going to go in and have a look in the building in a second. And I mean, you can already see from the outside, it's been totally destroyed, totally gutted. I mean, I'm guessing once the gas explosion happened, there was just a massive conflagration inside the building, which finished off anyone who was still alive.
Yeah, I mean, that's my understanding too. The last time I came here was a couple of years ago, and I got a taxi out here from the centre of town, and by complete coincidence, the taxi driver had been a pupil at this school.
Yeah.
So this school is School 134, and it's actually a German language school in Soviet times, where the kids were trained in German and Russian, obviously, too, but trained in, educated in German and Russian. So he told me, various bits and pieces about what it was like to come here as a kid, and then he knew a little bit about the siege as well. And we can take a walk inside. So yeah, we're going in. I mean, one thing that's kind of, for me, is eerily kind of resonant, and not in a good way, is that it reminds me a little bit of Beslan, because that, of course, was also a school siege, but in a very, very different way. There were actually children inside. Here it was just the site of a battle. No children were hurt, thankfully.
I mean, only when you get inside the building, Julius, can you see the level of devastation. There are no floors left. You can see scorch marks from obviously it was on fire at some stages. I mean, it's been completely gutted. And only in wartime would something like this be left literally as a museum piece. I mean, it must have looked like this within a couple of days after the battle itself, and it's still in exactly the same state.
Yeah, I mean, one thing, we're beginning to see the grasses grow, of course, after 4 years. But it's a bit spooky to think that, some of these bodies are still here. I mean, they're probably in cinders at this point.
Yeah.
But they didn't find all the bodies, according to what the locals told me.
In some ways, because it's such a beautiful day, it doesn't make it look as grim and as eerie as it must be on a dark evening.
But just thinking about the numbers involved, this must be one of the sort of great special forces losses in history almost. That amount of operatives killed in one particular day.
It's also a great last stand, though. I don't know how the Russians see this today, but it's, this is the Alamo. It's Rorke's Drift, but it doesn't go well for them. So it's the Alamo. I mean, small number of people holding out against impossible odds for 24 hours. I mean,
I think there's also, from that time I spent with Spetsnaz, there's also a bit of an arrogance there. It's like, we are not going to give up to those people. There's a sort of so it's not just, we're fighting other courageous men in battle and we are being brave. It's more kind of there's a hubristic element to it. Those dirty Nazi Ukrainians, no way are we going to give up to them. I think there's something like that going on. One of the ironies when I was with Spetsnaz in Chechnya is that several of them were Ukrainian. But
so some of the guys who died here might have been Ukrainian?
Potentially, although of course we're into that mixed identity question.
Yeah,
they may have had a Ukrainian name, but, identified as a Russian, who've lived in Russia for a long time.
We'll be back after the break. When we return, we leave Kharkiv, where Spetsnaz forces fought and died in a school siege in the opening hours of the invasion, and travel to Bucha on the outskirts of Kyiv. Bucha sits right next to Hostomel Airport, the target of a simultaneous airborne assault by Russia's VDV paratroopers. Taking Hostomel was the linchpin of the entire operation. Land the paratroopers, fly in reinforcements, and drive into Kyiv within 48 hours. We'll explain what happened, what it cost, and why the civilians of Bucha paid the heaviest price of all. Welcome back to Battleground Special Forces. We're now in Bucha, the suburb of Kyiv that became synonymous with Russian war crimes. But Bucha is also directly adjacent to Hostomel Airport, one of the most strategically important targets of Russia's opening gambit. While Spetsnaz were fighting street to street in Kharkiv, Russia's VDV Airborne forces were descending on Hostomel in helicopters, trying to crack open the road to the capital. The people buried in this cemetery lived and died in the shadow of both battles.
So, Julius, we're here in Bucha Cemetery. The podcast was here about 2.5 years ago. Some of our listeners might remember, where we actually interviewed the so-called gravedigger of Bucha, a local guy, maybe in his late 60s, not that older than me, actually, as it happens, or both of us, who had been press ganged by the Russians into digging graves for the many, many civilians who were murdered by the Russians. He estimated more than 500. The number fluctuates all over the place. But what we do know from walking up the far side of the cemetery are a number of individual graves of people who died within that window. That's the occupation when the Russians first arrived in Bucha, around about the 25th of February 2022, when the siege or the occupation was finally lifted, and that was about 6 weeks later on the 2nd of April 2022. So, you know, the evidence of Russian atrocities is here, or at least the consequences, but also, as we can see behind us, more recently, the Ukrainian soldiers who were killed.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, we had a kind of a fun morning at the zoo, you know, with the elephants and the gorilla, and it was all lovely. And now this is a sort of a, you know, bit of a cold shower, really, coming back to the realities of the war. I mean, one thing that's interesting about this cemetery, first of all, it's absolutely huge. I mean, maybe not on the scale of some of the world cemeteries, but it's very, very big for a suburban cemetery. And you get a real sense of all these layers of history. You have a lot of Soviet-era graves, which are quite touching because a lot of them have a picture showing the profession of the person who died. You know, there's a big articulated lorry. There are several guys with their cars. There's a couple of very nice Soviet airplanes, very picturesque. And then you've got the civilians who died, as you said, during those terrible atrocities in Bucha. You've got people, normal local people who died of natural causes. And then right at this end, you've got the recent casualties. And here, this young man here, in fact, both of these young men, they died last month, which makes you realize that this is not a finished story.
No, and two and a half years ago, this was a half the size, Julius. I mean, it is only the locals, obviously locals to the area who are buried here. It's worth mentioning, though, isn't it, having driven through Bucha, this is quite an upscale, upmarket area. It's obviously a dormitory town for Kyiv. People probably would have, you know, gone into their white-collar jobs, commuted into the city. Relatively smart area where the housing, I'm guessing, for Ukrainian standards would have been reasonably expensive. And then that terrible day on the 25th of February 2022, when out of the blue, an armoured column appeared on the edge of town, drove through town. And meanwhile, it had just passed through Hostomel airport. So we'll talk about Hostomel in a second, but, you know, just take yourself back to that time, early 2022. You're a civilian. Yes, you've heard that there's an air raid going on, that you know stuff's happening, that your country is at war. But the last thing you're expecting is to wake up in the morning and find Russian soldiers walking down your streets.
Yeah, absolutely. And for me, one of the things is I've never actually been to Ukraine lots of times, but I've never actually been to Bucha or Irpin or Hostomel, and it's all in this small area. It's sort of spread out area, but it's very, very flat. So you don't get a sense driving around of what exactly is where. So we drove around, you know, the back of Hostomel Airport. We spoke to some of the locals. Interestingly, both people I tried to speak to either couldn't speak Russian or didn't want to speak Russian, but they were speaking Ukrainian. And they feel like villages. They feel like they could be in the middle of nowhere, little villages with all this sort of signs, you know, older people, a couple of younger folk perhaps. From what I could take of the Ukrainian, quite a heavy sort of regional accent. And then you come here and you're almost back into Kiev, the city again. But of course, the fate of this area was not determined by the villages. It was determined by its proximity to Kiev. And that's why the Russians turned up here in 2022 in February. And yeah, that's something you've looked at quite a lot, Saul.
Yeah, I mean, I've been fascinated by this early stage of the war. As a military historian, this is my, you know, literally with my battle head on. And what were the Russians trying to do? Well, it's pretty obvious, Julius. We know, don't we, that they were attempting a coup de main. So they were going to take Hostomel Airport, which actually was a civilian airport, transport airport, also known as Antonov. And the Antonovs are not a coincidence, because the Antonov 225 was at that stage, I think still is, the largest airplane in the world. And there was one of them famously at Hostomel Airport, which was destroyed in the fighting I'm just about to explain. What were the Russians hoping to do? Well, they were going to send in their paratroopers and probably special forces. We haven't had absolute confirmation, but almost certainly they would have come in at some point to lead the spear head into Kyiv itself. And the plan is to come in on the morning of the 24th with a limited number of helicopters to capture the airfield and then bring in transport planes, Ilyushin 76s, I think they're called. You've traveled in one yourself, haven't you? Julius?
Back in the day, I traveled across Russia I get a lot of trouble for this, but in Russian military uniform. I was working as a journalist. I was sort of, let's call it embedded. That's a nice way of putting it. And yeah, so I'm quite familiar with that plane.
Yeah, okay, so not particularly comfortable way to fly, but anyone who's been on military transport will know it's not the end of the world. But the plan is to capture the airport first and then bring in effectively air landing. So you've got an airborne operation to begin with, and then you've got air landing, and obviously you can bring in heavier equipment, you can bring in vehicles, and then they can get on the march in. But it's all got to happen quite quickly. So this all happens on the morning of the 24th. And what's interesting is that the Ukrainians already knew they were coming. They had been given intelligence from the Americans, for the CIA and other sources that said there's going to be an attempt to take Hostomel Airport for this very reason. This will be a bridgehead to allow more airborne forces to come in, and this will be the first point of entry into Kyiv. Meanwhile, of course, they're bringing armoured forces down from Belarus, which, of course, we know is exactly what happens. Those two are going to coincide at Hostomel Airport, but that was not the Russian plan. The Russian plan was to take the airport quickly, bring in more people, as I say, with air landing troops, and then drive into Kyiv. The armoured forces are going to reinforce that initial incursion, but it all has to be done very quickly. And the plan, of course, is to decapitate the government. You take the capital, and really they're hoping it's going to be game over within 2 or 3 days. So the Ukrainians are forewarned and forearmed, but it's interesting because we were chatting about this earlier, and you made the point, well, yeah, they may have been forewarned, but that's not the whole story, is it? Because they didn't really want to give the game away to the Russians.
Well, I think this is one of the big problems the Ukrainians had at the beginning of the war, was that they were desperate not to give the Russians an excuse to attack. They still half believed that it might not happen, despite all the intelligence, despite all the warnings, despite everything pointing to it. You know, I think even Zelensky did not want to believe that it was going to happen. We like to be optimists in life, and it's very difficult to come to a conclusion that my country is about to be invaded and trashed, basically. And so to facilitate, or to give themselves every single chance of getting out of that war, they didn't want to do anything to antagonize the Russians. So a lot of military preparations that could have been made, not just in this area, but really in lots of areas. Maybe the east was the exception, where they did kind of reinforce, but around Kiev were not taken. Latterly, of course, that was heavily criticized by people, but you know, with hindsight, it's easy.
Yeah, because as the story I'm about to unfold, it was on a bit of a knife edge, and part of the problem was that the Ukrainians had not put enough troops to defend Antonov airfield, Hostomel, as it's also known. One of the other reasons, which I already mentioned, is it was a civilian airfield owned by the Antonov Corporation, the airplane corporation, and they put up a lot of obstacles to the military coming in. But nevertheless, by the morning of the 24th, when the Russians actually arrived, there were about 300 territorial defense force guys with an anti-aircraft gun, a couple of machine guns. I mean, they weren't heavily armed at all, and they're defending the perimeter. What happens next, which we've actually had an eyewitness account on our very first episode of Battleground Ukraine, and we recorded that in the summer of 2022, was with a British journalist who actually drove out here with a fixer, who we later used, actually first brought us to this cemetery, and they arrived as the Russians were capturing the airfield. So the beats of the story are basically this. The initial group come in about 30 helicopters, maybe about 200 or 300 paratroopers. They're effectively the elite. These guys are the pathfinders. They come in, but because the airfield is being defended, they probably didn't expect it to be, but because it's being defended, a lot of these aircraft, or some of these aircraft, are shot down. You can see some of the footage on YouTube. And there's quite a fierce gun battle that ends with the territorial defense forces being driven off the airfield. So the Russians are now in control. This is probably about midday. They were landed at about 11 midday 1. They're now in control, at which point Zaluzhny, obviously the then armed forces commander-in-chief, realizes the importance of Hostomel and orders a counterattack with heavier forces and heavy artillery, which retakes the airfield. So it's a real back and forth. It's one of those sort of classic things. And he's saying, listen, guys, we must be in control of the airfield by the evening. And they are. And the Ukrainian flags go up, and you can see there are pictures of Ukrainian soldiers celebrating on the airfield. The Russian paratroopers, by the way, have taken a lot of casualties. Something like 500 are reckoned to have been killed in the battle for this airfield. denied by Russia, of course, but we expect that. It was a very, very brutal fight, and the survivors of that initial incursion force have been pushed back into the forests which surround Hostomel. Hostomel, as we know, is only just a few kilometers from where we're standing now. The plan was to film there, Julius, but it can sometimes be tricky when you want to get onto military installations.
It can be. I mean, we talked to a couple of locals and they were friendly, but as soon as we pulled up, we hadn't even got to the gates actually. We just literally stopped the car to check our maps, and soldiers appeared immediately and said, what do you want, what do you want? And we said, well, we're trying to find the main entrance. At that point they were still friendly and cooperative. They said, go up there on the left. But once we got to the main gates themselves, and again we stopped short, we were very polite and walked up to them, and they said, and I just said, is this the main gate to the airport? And they said, no information. We're not giving you any information at all. I said, well, we're, accredited journalists. We're from England and we're working. And they said, absolutely no information. Time for you to leave. So they weren't aggressive. They weren't going to do anything nasty to us, but it was clear that this was not going to happen.
No, and, which is a shame, because it would have been nice to have got into the airfield and told this story there and possibly seen the wreck of the Antonov, maybe one or two Russian helicopters. I don't know if they've sort of left them there. The Ukrainians are quite good, actually, at keeping battlefield detritus as a sign of their victory, and the Russians do something similar, don't they? Yeah,
absolutely. I mean, another thought I have in my head, looking at all this is, well, two things really. First of all, the hubris of the Russians. We've got the attack on Hostomel. They just assumed that they would walk in there and take it. But secondly, the supporting column that came down the road from Belarus. They just did everything wrong. It ended up, as everybody will remember, in this huge long line of vehicles, tens and tens and tens of kilometers. They tried going off-road. They got stuck in the mud. They went on rougher roads. They found out that the people in charge in Russia had been stealing the tires and putting cheap Chinese tires on. They run out of fuel because the fuel had been stolen. They didn't have enough food. They were begging the locals for food, or trying to get it at gunpoint at least. So that, again, this huge sort of hubristic thing of, will be, it'll all take a few days, maybe a week or two. And of course we know that they sent in, they sent in riot police, they sent in, I think they even sent in a brass band. I mean, they sent in, all this stuff.
For the celebration.
For the celebrations. And that sort of strikes me as one thing. The other thing that comes into my head, especially in a place like this, because, there's all this sort of light talk and, light analysis in the West about, they should give up Donetsk, they should give up the Donbass, or why can't they just trade land for peace and all this kind of stuff. When you look at this and you realize that hundreds of thousands of Ukrainians have died by now. I mean, I don't want to put an exact number because we don't know, but they have paid for this defense in blood over and over and over again. And so to have somebody lightly say, well, that place that you've defended and lost so many lives to defend, you're going to have to just now give up. And that's going to go to the Russians. And we know what will happen if the Russians occupy it. That's a hell of a lot to ask.
Yeah, I think the memory of what happened here at Bucha is still very strong in Ukrainian minds. I mean, of course, the similar sort of thing is happening in the occupied territories where stuff's going on that we don't know about and we're not going to know about, presumably, for a while. But the brutality of the Russian occupation was underlined by what happened at Bucha. Just to finish off the last bit of the Hostomel airport story, because it is quite interesting. I mean, Hostomel's a little bit closer to Belarus than we are at the moment, and that was the exact point at which the armored column was coming down. And you spoke about how ultimately it was ambushed and taken to pieces, and it never really got that close to Kyiv. But that was a little bit further down the road, I think, where that took place. They actually managed to get to the airport on the 25th, so that's the day after the battle I've described. The Ukrainians are in control of the airfield. They retake it. And once they retake it in a combination of more helicopters coming in and ground forces. So it's a kind of pincer attack. The Ukrainians don't have enough people there, and they're driven out. And that is the situation that remains with the Russians in occupation of the airfield and, of course, this surrounding area as they try and push a little bit closer to Kyiv, although the opportunity for surprise is now gone at this stage, including as far as Irpin, which is not far from where we're standing now. And they finally withdraw. That great moment, as we all remember from the press, where the Russians decide to pull back on the 2nd of April. And the 2nd of April is the point at which the killings stop here. So, if you are minded to find out who of the locals was murdered during that period of occupation, you're looking for the dates 25th of February to the 2nd of April. And anyone who's died in that period, yes, there will be some from natural causes, but if they're relatively young, they will have been killed by the Russians.
Yeah, and today we almost feel like you're in a sort of a halfway house here. We've got these, just in front of us here past the camera, we've got these new warehouse buildings. They're relatively smart, relatively European. There are new housing blocks. There's some quite expensive houses going up here. But then, just an hour ago, we saw massive piles of smashed and burnt up vehicles. You can see the detritus of war. The roads have been paved, but as soon as you get off those main roads, they're all full of potholes. It feels like a place that's sort of halfway through a recovery phase, and hopefully it does eventually recover, and this will be what's left, this graveyard, to remember what actually happened here in February 2022.
The Spetsnaz soldiers who died in that school in Kharkiv were among Russia's best. The VDV paratroopers who fell at Hostomel were the tip of the spear. Both failed, and in failing they gave Ukraine the time it needed to mount a defence that stopped the most powerful military in Europe at the gates of its own capital. The graves in Bucha tell the rest of the story. Thanks for watching Battleground Special Forces. Do join us on Friday for the latest news from Ukraine, and if you have any thoughts or questions, please do email us. Please do email us at podbattleground@gmail.com. We'll see you next time. Goodbye.